Hey everybody, how we doing today? I enjoyed that Coltrane episode. Seems like most of you guys did too. Uh, it's tough to pick from a guy like Coltrane's career. There's some days you wake up and you want to hear Crescent, or you want to hear Love Supreme, or you want to hear Village Vanguard. You want that intensity, that rawness, that honesty, which Train can always provide you. Sometimes you want to have a little easier listening. It's hard for me to pick any of the Prestige stuff as his greatest work or my favorite of his work for several reasons. A, he's very much still developing, which you could argue he always kind of was, but also because a lot of those records aren't unified pieces from one session with the same lineup. They're kind of piecemealed together from several different sessions, often with different rhythm sections, so they lack a cohesion. Albums like The Believer, Lush Life, these things came after he left Prestige. A lot of his work actually does. He only makes 4, maybe 5 records for Prestige officially in 57, 58 before he's moving on. And yet Prestige is coupling and putting together session vault stuff and stuff he did with other people under different names and repackaging and new packaging. I think Black Pearls is another example, like The Last Train. There's a lot of Prestige stuff that's really hard to say this is an album in the sense of how we see an album. That being said, I love the Believer record. There's some great stuff on there. I can't really say it's my favorite Coltrane. And again, I'm kind of judging by what record do I reach for the most by Train or by Miles. And there's always going to be a handful of people that are like, oh, it could be the guy. But I thought that Ellington was probably the one I had reached for the most. And so when I bring up the gigs the most, along with the Hartman one. But I find his playing on the Hartman one's fairly overstated, and the band has to play in two worlds. It's kind of the soft lushness of Johnny Hartman, and then the much more up-tempo double time when John comes in. Someone else argued that John was very able to graft himself into every other session he was on. And I don't feel that's the case very much at all. He mentioned the Milt Jackson record, and I feel like Milt's struggling to keep Train on the tracks. And if you listen to even the opening refrains of some of that stuff, some of his volumes, and some of this is also from the Atlantic box set with the metal spine on disc, where they put everything chronologically. You kind of can hear some of these developments and how much he's kind of too loud initially, and he's Train though. He's one of the greats of all time. So the rock and roll thing I did a couple episodes back is still stirring the pot. People are still watching it and commenting on it, which is really fun. And clearly there is no great one answer to it, and there's not going to be. We're not going to come to a consensus. I think Metallica makes as strong a case as anybody, and along with the Beach Boys and Aerosmith. I do think it's weird that there's not a more obvious set of candidates for this list, especially when you consider the elite status of some of those great UK bands. It's just a weird phenomenon. As being the geography guy that I am, it's always kind of stuck out to me how many of the great bands were British throughout many of the eras of music. And that being said, the great American bands are obviously Earth, Wind & Fire, the Ohio Players, the JBs, Booker T and the MGs. Like, it's black music here in America that's so phenomenal. And what the rest of the world collects when they collect American music is black music. Speaking geographically, another little revelation I've had making the cards. I'm up to about 550 of the fronts made. And I want to get the fronts finished. It's probably going to be around 700 now, it looks like, for this first initial set. And that's having made the cutoff around 1970. So guys that show up late 60s, into the 70s, we're not really discussing any of those guys at all. But these cards have taught me a lot making them. And they should teach you guys a lot too. And if you see a record that has 2 or 3 cards as sidemen, you go, I got his card, you'll know that's a quality record. The number of guys that a lot of records I'm pulling, I'm like, oh, I made cards for all 4 of those guys, and so you're seeing this incredible lineage of jazz men and women. I've tried to incorporate as many women into this game as possible. And the one place where I'll probably omit some people is the singers. It's a tough thing to categorize, and the line between pop singer and jazz singer is very blurred, and most of them made both. Most of them made pop records and jazz records. And a singer, you can sing in a jazz style like a horn and kind of improvise on melody and reshape rhythm, but you can also just be backed by a great jazz group to be a great jazz singer. And I think a lot of these singers are very much put under that microscope of who is producing my session, what label, what are they after, what demographic they try to reach. And so someone like Teddy King is going to be impacted greatly by what label she's recording for. And her intimate Storyville stuff versus her stuff for Decca and Chorale and other big labels, RCA, it's going to be quite a big difference. So label is an important thing to understand. You know, even the great artists, there's stuff they're going to make on a Riverside versus on Capitol. Cannonball Adderley, I'm looking at you. There's going to be a great gap there. And the payday comes with the bigger labels, no question about it. But the artistic freedom and the integrity of the small labels is unrivaled. And that's the stuff that really kind of stands the test of time much more efficiently and much more in totality. But speaking of geography, I did an episode probably a few weeks ago, a bit of a teary-eyed episode actually, about seeing the Great Migration unfolding in these cards. Seeing the oldest generation of jazz cats from the 1910s, 20s being mostly born in the South. The guys that next generation were, and most of those guys from those days lived in the South, New Orleans, and maybe made up to Chicago, New York, but they always kind of kept their roots in the South. That next generation was kind of born in the South and moved up to the North, the Rust Belt and all the industrial cities. And then that third generation of who we consider the Blue Note kids and a lot of the Prestige and Riverside, those cats were mostly born or spent most of their life in the North. And there's such a interesting pattern that's developed that I can look at a guy who's on my list to do next. I'm like, oh, I'm going to do so-and-so. I'm starting to be able to almost predict but where this guy's from. And I've started to kind of almost guess. Like, okay, this guy's got to be Philly, probably, maybe Detroit. And I was surprised how often I've been right. There's a real difference in mentality and personality of a swing era cat who was born in the South and lived in the South and was a Southern gentleman and had to deal with open racism all of his life, how he carries himself, versus the guy who was born and raised in Detroit and was never really raised around that white ignorance. Their tolerance and impatience for it is much diminished, and their aggression and their willingness to speak on it is much more pronounced. And so there's a combination of looking at the chronology of a player. Oh, he came up in late 50s. That's going to tell you something right there in itself. But where they're from is also kind of shockingly a small part of who they are and how they sound and what movement they're a part of. Almost surprisingly so. And the guys who were from Detroit, the guys who were from Philly, the guys who were from New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, there's more of an edge to them, more of an aggression, more of a, we ain't messing around with you, we're not going to shine no shoes, we ain't going to dance with no massa. Ain't none of that playing in their shtick. And the guys from the South, they definitely seem to have more of a link to that past and a connection to it, and a tolerance of ignorance and willingness to overlook. It's just minor observations I'm making, but it's very tangible, a lot of it. I was watching some documentaries the other day on jazz. The great Louis Prima, a guy from Treme in New Orleans. What a great career this guy had. And we kind of remember him more for his Pennies from Heaven and I'm Just a Gigolo and those great songs he did in the 50s with Keely Smith. But he was really an institution of swing and a hard driving player. And once Sal Butera gets in the group, those two, the energy of when you watch their footage from playing together, they're pretty incredible. I was really impressed. I was really surprised by just how fierce Butera and Prima were together. And of course, he does end up in the Vegas circuit at the end of his life, which more white cats did, you know. And he tries to reinvent himself and ends up kind of trying doing more R&B, popper stuff by the 70s. But Stitt was quite the character. I mean, not Stitt. Prima was quite the character. And his little relationship on stage with Keely, how she would sit there kind of rigid and not move and almost be condescending in her looks and her tones. And Prima would almost be fondling over her in adulation and sexual wanting. Like, you could just see this kind of, and she would just be kind of rigid and almost like, you know, she was very emotionless on stage, but it was part of their shtick. It was part of their whole persona. And it was a pretty fascinating watch. I also saw some of the Billie Holiday, Artie Shaw era stuff where she was asked to ride in the freight elevator, and because the guests were complaining about Negroes in the elevator. And we explained to them that they're the entertainment, and the people who travel to New York from the South just weren't about to enter an elevator with a colored person. And Artie had to go to Billie and ask her if she was okay riding in the freight elevator, which she, of course, said she wasn't. And Artie Shaw said he couldn't blame her. And so she ends up quitting Artie Shaw's band. And even though in the younger years of her career she tours with a lot of great swing bands, she stops touring. She stops playing the country. She stays mostly in New York and works with Norman Granz, and her health deteriorates. And the sadness of Billie is a story that we don't need to get into too much today, but you just see some of these stories as they're told by the people who are involved. And it can't help but make you feel a little something. It's compelling. I like to watch a lot of other history stuff too. And when you're talking ancient Egypt or, you know, the Mesoamerican story, or there's just so many parts of history that are complex, the Revolutionary War. I like to watch that Oak Island show just because I was raised with that mystery as a kid. And the different facets of who could possibly have planted that stuff and what they were planting, and was it used for the American Revolution, and all these kind of interesting thoughts. And that history is all so exciting and interesting. But yet the history of jazz, the history of urbanity, the American complex system that is urbanity, and those new urban formulas that come to bear in places like New York and New Orleans, where different cultures are having to interact in these small spaces, and it's breeding tolerance. It's breeding interaction and sharing of cultural traditions, and jazz is born from that. You can't extricate jazz from the American urban experience. And jazz is very much an urban expression. And you don't stay in the country to make jazz music, you go to the city. And there's a country blues that stayed in the country. There's a country rock, a country music that's very much a rural thing. You can go to any little hoedown in any small town and see some country band playing Alan Jackson and Garth Brooks and all the other little modern countries, or the classic Patsy Clines. That's rural music. Jazz is an urban music. It's a complex music. It's a propulsed music. The energy of that urban fabric is what informs jazz. And it's just an incredible thing to see this chapter of American history with its backdrop in jazz, and to see how exciting and compelling. And when I study jazz and American history with that jazz backdrop, there's an extra level of excitement and amazement that I just find so compelling and intriguing. And it's just kind of real revealing to see how, out of all this tension and all this chaos, this art form was able to make such a beautiful expression of the human condition and the human mind, soul, and spirit. And that honesty is such a compelling thing. It's what makes American history very special. And it's what makes jazz very special, is it tells the story of a people who had no voice. And one of the things that people kind of will debate with me at times is how alive is jazz today. And while there are great players out there today who are doing it and keeping its legacy alive, in my mind, there's such a clear demarcation of when jazz goes into disuse as R&B kind of rises and rock and roll comes out of that. And to me, the final nail in that coffin really has to be when that microphone gets handed to those R&B singers and they start speaking what was never spoken before, because civil rights has now opened that door for them to do so. And I think a lot of people who used to get that message from jazz could now get it from Curtis Mayfield and Sam Cooke and Marvin Gaye. And I think it changes the landscape in such a way that jazz never really regains its bullhorn. And that's the problem. It never really gets that voice of the people back. And it becomes very much the voice of the individual. And it loses some of its impact once you get past the late 60s. It could still be great. And there's a lot of 70s jazz that I love. Put on some Herbie Hancock, some of that CTI stuff that I really do dig. George Benson makes some incredible records. I love some Roy Ayers 70s stuff. I even like some of the Miles stuff. Weather Report's fantastic. These guys were great players. But it no longer seems to speak about a history and a people and a movement and a time and a place as much as it now speaks about these individuals and their place within the world. And I think it changes the focus. It changes the meaning, the purpose. It doesn't diminish the musicianship. And you can by all means love all eras of jazz. They're all there to be loved. But boy, there's a special thing that connects the fibers of this country's youth and adolescence. As we go through these incredible changes in the 20th century, jazz is the mouthpiece for so much of that change. Jazz is very compelling. And when I watch other things of history, I'm like, wow, you don't have any great music going on in the background of this, do you? And then you put on a jazz history piece, and you're just kind of in awe of the fantastic energy. Louis Prima, again, is behind Sing 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 as well. And that tells you how hard Louis Prima swings. And of course, Fletcher Henderson and the great Benny Goodman Orchestra kills Sing Sing Sing. It's just insane when you hear that band churn out that Louis Prima song. But Prima's such a great talent that really gets overlooked. I've always loved, some of his poppier stuff. It's always been really fun to DJ that stuff. But I really didn't know how hard he was a swinger. And the guy was a hard-working fella, man. He worked all of his life every day for this music. And it just shows you that you can be Italian, you can be a Jew, you can be black. If you have a message you want to speak, jazz will help you get that message out there. But you just can't be fake about it. That's the problem. I have a friend in Austria who doesn't watch me anymore because he doesn't think I validate him enough being a jazz guitar player here in the current era. And it's just like, if you're a white rapper, you can be great, but you can't talk about the black experience in Chicago. You just don't know it. You can't really speak on it. You can only speak on what you know. So there's lots of different facets to it. This is just a little fun thing. Me and Ken are going to make another episode fairly soon. It's kind of determined by his schedule. He's a pretty busy guy. I have a little more free time on my hands. I'm trying to track down an old DJ job of mine, hoping I can get some gigs there from them. But it's a slow process watching that all unfold. But we're getting through. Hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. I do want to show you this great Sonny Stitt 10-inch. This is on the Roos label. And Sonny Stitt, what a great Burt Goldblatt cover that is. It's at the top, hi-hat. And it's fantastic is what it is. It's absolutely fantastic. And you really hear how Sonny Stitt is kind of this bridge between the tone of Ben Webster and the sound of Illinois Jacquette and the modern guys the Stan Getzes, the Sonny Rollins, the John Coltrane's, even the Dexter Gordons, Stanley Turrentines. Sonny Stitt's this great bridge in that era and he always had Parker in his sound as well. So he could play the breathy ballad like a Ben Webster. He could play the fiery modernity of a Parker or a Rollins. And he really dovetails between alto and tenor on a lot of his different eras. He played both quite a lot. Sonny Stitt's really kind of an overlooked guy with a really big body of work that doesn't seem to reach the esteem of a lot of his contemporaries. Stitt's a guy who should be really appreciated. He's a fantastic player and a big influence on a lot of the guys who came after him. And of course, Parker was a big influence on him, but Parker was a big influence on everybody. It's a bit like a LeBron James. When LeBron James comes along, he changes the game for everybody, not just his position. Everybody now wants to be, able to run the floor, shoot the threes, and play in transition, and play small in your big frame. And Stitt was that guy that could just dovetail between swing and modern, and bebop and post bop, and play some hard bop and play some blues, play some soul jazz. He really has his toe in everything. But when you're an experienced veteran player, those transitions aren't that difficult to make. And a lot of times it's simply the setting that you're in, the sideman that you're playing with, the label that you're playing for, are making those dictations. Some of Sonny Stitt's recordings for Argo in the mid-'60s are outstanding. Great quality production. Just incredible sounds coming out of Argo in those mid-'60s, early '60s records as they start to tradition, the change over to the Cadet imprint. Their production sound at that point is really top of the mark and pretty fantastic. So anyway, just a fun little bridge episode here. Me and Ken are talking. We're going to try to figure out when we can do another episode again. I'm also trying to get my friend Gary, who's a writer in Minneapolis, who's a big advocate in the black community. He's worked with inner city youth for a long time. He often represents them in youth court, trying to help them get best case scenario outcomes for some of the things these kids get into and how hard it is to be a black kid nowadays in anywhere. And he's going to talk with us and share with us some of these stories and some of his feelings. And I think it'll help some of you guys understand what I'm talking about, what these black cats existed and lived with in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, even by hearing what some of these kids are going through today in the present. For you Europeans, I think it'll be really eye-opening to hear some of these stories. I've seen and followed some of them through his Facebook posts, and they're enough to tear your heart out, man. It's so sad, the circumstances that a lot of people are forced to live in, and the limited opportunities that often force them into uncomfortable situations where they make bad choices, and then everyone looks at them like, why are you a criminal? It's like, I wasn't given a lot of choice, and Gary's one of those guys who's out there really trying to help make a difference. And that's one of the things about grown black men. Guys who reach their 40s and they've had their own kids, but those kids are kind of grown up. I know so many of them that volunteer, that help out, that create places for young black kids to hang out, parenting situations for kids who don't have parenting. Simple, take kids to a basketball game, take kids to all kinds of different things. I can think of a lot of my friends, who had no obligation to be out there doing this service, but they felt like they had no choice. To help these kids is the right thing to do. And a lot of them dedicate a lot of their time to being in the community and helping young black kids that aren't related to them in any way. And they help white kids as well. But white kids have a ton more resources. Their outcomes in court are usually a lot more beneficial. You can be a white kid, open up fire on people, and be considered not guilty. It's not an equal system by any means. So anyway, just a little chat with you today. We'll move on to the next episode coming up soon. Again, the trading cards, I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm having so much fun making them. I've learned a lot making them. And I got some ideas for how I'm going to do the backs, I think. I'm trying to do some research on printing. It doesn't make most sense for us all to print them ourselves. I've had a few people suggest I should go to Michael Kuskuna, and some of the people that I know through Ken, and maybe trying to get some official licensed help. But that's going to change this process greatly. And my guess is they would pare it down to a much smaller set and change a lot of what I'm trying to accomplish here. So I'm still weighing all my options in that department. So y'all be safe. You have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Check out some Sonny Stitt. Sonny Stitt's a bad boy. Y'all be safe. Peace.